to the training session of the Fitchburg School Committee. My pleasure this evening to welcome Ms. Tracy Novick from MASC. Ms. Novick.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stevens. It's good to see you. I usually would introduce myself, but I know that you all know who I am. And in fact, I think the policy subcommittee and I feel like we're going to miss you all when I'm not seeing you once a month anymore. So I'm always really pleased to do a superintendent evaluation workshop with committees before they sort of dive in. Partly for a selfish reason, because it cuts down on the number of panicked phone calls we get while after you've got materials distributed and before you're trying to put it back together again. So I'd much rather you all had this conversation now than had it further on. Some of this is our fairly standard kind of superintendent evaluation, although I did add the goals that you're actually going to be evaluating your superintendent based on. And just as a reminder, because I think it's important for school committees to know that they're part of kind of a larger process. The evaluation of the superintendent is governed by the same state regulation that the evaluation of every other licensed educator is. So what you're doing for the superintendent is what is also done for principals and is done for teachers and is done for anyone who holds a license as an educator in Massachusetts. That was actually a pretty major change when they passed the law and then the regulation that put superintendents under the same evaluation system. But I think that in many ways it's actually been really good for school committees, as much as sometimes people find it a little overwhelming, because it has really standardized the practice. I know it's particularly better for superintendents because it's not sort of people being evaluated on vibes, which we occasionally saw based earlier, but it's actually a standardized process. It does directly tie the evaluation of the superintendent to the goals that you've set for the district, and also then standardizes some of the things that we expect of every educator in Massachusetts within the standards. And the focus that is on educator evaluation far beyond the superintendent, true for any educator who's being evaluated, is on this notion of continuous improvement. So you're not evaluating to evaluate and then sort of be done, that's it. The evaluation then immediately leads you back into the cycle for goal setting for the next year. And so I really would encourage you, as you're writing your own evaluations and then as you're moving into next steps and so forth, to really think of the educator evaluation in that guise, through that lens, that what this is about is not saying, here's a grade, as much as that tends to be the headline. Good to see you, Madam Mayor. It's really to say, here are things we think you're doing really well, and here are things we know you can improve, and here's the places where we see that. So the more that you can kind of think of your evaluation in that framework, the stronger you'll be in terms of putting things together. So some things that we know to be true. And again, some of this was based on, if you're a long-serving member, you might remember doing this before standard educator evaluation. As much as the first one sounds maybe almost sarcastic, it requires attention to the evaluation process. The main thing is that this isn't something where it's sort of, surprise, now it's time to evaluate the superintendent. It needs to be part of what's actually happening over the course of the year. That's why we actually put it that way. For the most part, annual evaluations are required. Long-serving superintendents can work with their school committee and go for a 2-year cycle. There is this requirement to use a standard format, so you don't get to make up your own evaluation process. There are parts of it that can be adapted, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so any of you who have seen me present on anything knows that kind of everything exists in circles, right? The budget is a cycle, the evaluation process is a cycle, policy setting is a cycle. So you start in every cycle with self-assessment. Now, part of the reason I give this to you now, rather than just sort of jump you straight into the evaluation, is I do want to encourage you to really think of the fact that you're at the evaluation point as one of the steps on this circle, with the idea that you're coming out of one step and going into another step, and how do you make sure that you as a committee are doing that as strongly as possible. The evaluation leads to goal setting, which then leads to implementation. There is a mid-cycle formative review, and then what you'll be conducting shortly will be the end-of-cycle review or the summative assessment. Now, what the components of the actual evaluation are does have this sort of 5-step cycle. The tool itself, the rubric itself, has 2 parts. It has the goals that you've agreed upon for the superintendent, and then it has the standard set of 4 standards that every superintendent in Massachusetts is evaluated on. That's the performance rubric. And through that, you then rate on the goals, you rate on the standards, come up with a summative rating. And we'll talk a little bit more about process as we go through this. Now, one of the things I want to encourage you also as you go through this, not both for the evaluation, but then also when you move into goal setting, is to remember that the goals of the superintendent are part of this structure of goals that you as a school committee set for the district. So I noticed that one of the goals was working on a strategic plan. Those are often what you then set as the district goals, right? The underlying foundation. Building on that then become the superintendent's goals as well as the school improvement plans. If you decide to set goals for the school committee, that's also part of that. Administrator goals should be stemming from that, with teacher goals stemming from that. And as you know, focus of the school committee always should be on student improvement and student achievement, however it is that you define that. So this is actually, working through some of the things that you probably will be doing both as part of your strategic plan, but then also coming out of the evaluation and working towards the next set of goals, particularly as I think you're probably moving out of that sort of introductory superintendent process at this point, right? That's a 2-year cycle. So that will be ending with this evaluation. You'll then be moving into, okay, we're not doing that part anymore. What are we doing instead? So here are some things to think about as you do that. Both in terms of the strategic plan, which I, again, assume would continue to be part of it, but think also not just about, let me back up and say this. It can be very easy for school committees to get into, and I'm not saying not to do this, but to get into kind of everything is how much are X going to go up by, right? What are test scores going to go up by? What are this going to go up by? What are that going to go up by? Make sure whatever of that portion you're doing, and again, very often student goals are something of that nature, is being tied into this notion of where do we want to be? What kind of school district do we want to have? What's important to us? What do we want to actually be working on, both as a school district and as a community? Now, the requirement is that goals that you set, and again, think of this not only in terms of setting your goals, but then also in terms of how you evaluate your goals, right? They need to be specific and strategic. They need to be measurable. They need to be action-oriented. R has many. They need to be rigorous, realistic, and results-focused, and they need to be timed and tracked. And one thing that impressed me about the goals that you had gotten, that you had adopted for the superintendent for this year, is that you not only had the goal, but you also had this sort of benchmark and this list of steps as to outcomes and how you were going to get there. And what's good about that is it does tend to keep you focused on these are things that are going to happen. They're going to happen on a particular timeline. I'm not going to tell you not to sort of shoot for the moon, but if you're shooting for the moon, make sure you're shooting for the moon in ways that are concrete and measurable steps along the way, rather than just sort of putting a pie in the sky kind of thing out there. So at the beginning of the process, you work with the superintendent to draft the goals. This part I've actually included here because this is one suggestion I would make for you for next year because I didn't see that you had done it this year. So when you adopt the goals for the superintendent, I strongly recommend that you look at the rubric of the standards, the 4 standards, which have the indicators under them, and find the indicators that align with the goals that you're setting for the superintendent. Because one of the things that's really important, and this is something that has actually happened partly through work that MASC has done with both MASS and DESE, you don't have to evaluate based on every indicator. You have to evaluate based on each of the 4 standards, but you don't have to use every indicator under the standards. The thing is, though, that you need to have agreed at the beginning of the cycle which indicators you're going to use, okay? So this is a note not for now, but for after you get through the evaluation, when you get the next set of draft goals, have a conversation with the superintendent, and maybe the superintendent will even do this as he's drafting his goals. What indicators under those 4 standards align with the goals that he's proposing that you set out? And then you as committee members do the same sort of comparison. Because then if you've all agreed, again, at the beginning of the cycle, you can choose to then evaluate, you can as a committee agree to only evaluate based on those indicators. The reason for that, by the way, is because there's something like 28 indicators, okay? Now, the concern that I sometimes hear from school committee members is they say, okay, but that means we're not evaluating based on everything. That doesn't mean that the superintendent doesn't have to do everything, okay? That just means that you're not focused on the improvement in those areas. So, you know, as you're having this conversation about these are the things that are going to be the goals for the superintendent for this coming year, that's naturally going to lead to particular things under each of those standards. Just figure out what they are and do the matching game and set those as what you're going to be using as the indicators on which you evaluate next year, okay? So again, that's a note for next time. And I think based on the information that you got from this set of goals, you're going to actually have a really easy time doing it because you're getting really good sort of thinking, not just the goals themselves, but sort of thinking about the goals. So you're being set up for success in terms of that. The other thing that's a good thing to do at the beginning of the process, and again, you may have done this, but if you didn't, do it next time. Essentially ask yourselves the question, how will we know? How will we know that we've gotten there? Now, again, if it's something very straightforward like X% of students will be doing Y by the end of the year, that's a pretty easy one to measure. But in some cases, goals are a little bit less sort of data specific in terms of it not being a percentage or something of that nature. If that's the case, that's fine. But make sure that you among yourselves agree, here are the things we're going to see along the way. Okay, and again, having that outline of here are the benchmarks sets you up both for what those artifacts potentially are going to be. And the other thing that it does, which we also recommend, is it leads you to, and I think that you actually do this, a potential of a school-long agenda, a year-long agenda, okay? In other words, everybody knows that you're going to have, there's sometime in the spring you're going to have a budget presentation. You're going to have a budget deliberation. Everybody knows that sometime in the fall you're going to get the MCAS scores and you're probably going to have a presentation on that. There are some times over the course of the year where there's regular reports that kind of always happen. Something that you can do when you have the goals and you've adopted them is you can say, okay, so here are the places where we would expect to see reports out from the superintendent on particular things that have to do with the benchmarks that are under those goals. And you can actually say, okay, well, that means that sometime in November, we're going to see this. And sometime in April, we're going to see this, okay? And again, that's something that might be coming from the superintendent that you might discuss together. But if you're benchmarking that along the way, the other thing you're not doing is, as a school committee, getting this sort of overwhelming, feels like a dump of information in May or June, where suddenly, oh my gosh, there are all of these artifacts, and we have to go through all of them and somehow figure out whether or not this has been happening. Instead, that sort of paying attention along the way says, oh yeah, we saw in October this, we saw this in December, we saw this in March. I remember that, you know, I know that you all do a lot of great sort of collecting of information and sharing it anyway. That's a very easy thing to say, and we're putting it all into a Google folder or whatever. And so when it comes to evaluation, you're all going to be able to just pull open that folder and see the presentation in October and the presentation in December and the presentation in March. But again, it's not the first time you've seen it all, okay? Don't do what I did the first year that this happened. I was actually on the school committee the first time the year this was adopted, and we were like all going to do a great job. And I walked into the school committee office in Worcester, and there were literally three-ring binders this thick with all of the evidence. Now, of course, we were also using all of the indicators. So don't set yourselves up to do that. Okay, nobody has that kind of time. And also it makes it really hard to focus on the things you want the superintendent to improve on, right? Because you're saying, oh, I got to grade this too. I got to grade this too. What do you really need to do? So what do you need as you're starting this out? And again, remember, some of this is also now what you need on this end, right? You've agreed upon your goals. You're thinking about your outcomes. When you're evaluating now, when you have those goals, you can think, did you get to the outcomes, right? This notion of the choose which indicators go with your goals. Note for next time, right? Consider this my asterisk for you for next time. One of the things my former colleague Dorothy Presser used to say is if you have too many, you don't have any. Because if you're doing all of them, you can't actually pay attention to them very well. Something you can do although if you do this, we believe you probably will be the first school committee in Massachusetts to do so. You can choose to weigh the standards, right? So there's 4 standards. If you felt that you really needed to focus on instructional leadership, you could weigh that. You could not do a quarter, a quarter, a quarter. You could do one of them weighing more than the others. Now, the 2 things are, you need to make sure that you agree at the beginning of the cycle that that's what you're doing, so you can't do it now. And make sure everybody understands how the math works. And I know that sounds like a joke, but I'm not kidding, because sometimes people already get themselves trapped between the 2 sets of parts of the rubric. And then if you add some calculation in terms of weighting on the other side, you may well get yourself into a bit of a conniption, which I think is probably why people haven't done it. As we said, discuss the evidence. Something at this point you should be doing is be considering what evidence you have and what evidence is being presented to you by the superintendent in terms of meeting the goals. And then, as I said, this can lend you to a year-long agenda. Now, something I should have said at the beginning, by the way, is that if you have any questions at any point, please just stop me and don't wait till the end. So,
with that being said, can I interrupt?
Absolutely.
Can you just repeat what you just said about the standards?
About the weighing of the standards or about the indicators?
You were saying that we don't have to necessarily weigh in as heavily on certain standards?
So
I just
there's
want to
2
hear that
things.
again.
Right. So there's 4 standards, right?
Yes.
You have the option when you agree for the next set of goals, so you can't do this now for this set of goals, of saying, we really as a committee feel that we want to focus on management operations during this coming year, for example. And so rather than the 4 standards, each counting equally, right, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, we instead are going to say that, I'm going to make this up to make the math, right? We're going to say that the operations and management one is going to count twice as much as the other 3 standards. Now, you can do that, but you would all have to agree at the beginning of your cycle that you were doing that. And then my recommendation is, and then make sure everybody understands how the math works. Now, keep in mind at the same time that you would potentially be doing this, the recommendation that I'm also strongly making to you is that you choose at the beginning of the goal setting cycle which indicators you're going to use to evaluate the superintendent for next year. Because you have to hit all 4 standards, but each of those standards has multiple indicators underneath. So choose which indicators align with the goals that you're setting for the superintendent. And you'll end up, part of the reason I recommend doing this, by the way, is I've done it both ways. You end up with a much more coherent evaluation if you're not just sort of all over the place on the standards grading on everything, but you're actually grading on, oh, this goal means that we're doing this. This goal also means we're doing this, okay, underneath the standards. So for setting goals next year and for what you actually have right now, you have to set them in. Yep, please go ahead.
Okay, so that means we need to have a meeting
Yep.
where every student committee member is present so that we can all agree on that. And, I'm not trying to put another meeting on us, but we don't have a meeting like that where we can sit down together and decide things like that. So moving forward, is it possible for us to do that? I mean, I would like to be able to participate in that, and I don't know when this would take place. If 3 people get together and talk about it, I would like to be. How does that work? How does it?
So the goals of the superintendent aren't official goals until they're adopted by the school committee. So that should be. It doesn't have to be a separate meeting. It can be part of a regular agenda. But there should be some point after you've done the evaluation, after the superintendent's had a chance to absorb that, and then to consider about what else is sort of coming down the pike and what needs to happen next, where the superintendent comes back to you and says, okay, so for next year, here is what I would propose as my goals, okay? As I said, either coming from the superintendent or from your side should also be as part of that. And given those 4 standards, here are the indicators that those most directly tie to. I would suggest that those be the ones that you're evaluating on for next year as well. And I only add that because you actually otherwise have some great process in terms of you've got the benchmarks, you've got sort of the how will we know that this happened kind of question already in the document that you've received. And so you adopt them, The other thing that's nice about sort of thinking about what you're going to have when is you also can set when the mid-cycle review is going to be, right, at the same time, and to know when the evaluation is going to be at the same time. And that way we don't end up with sort of like an, oh my gosh, it's, March and we haven't done a mid-cycle review or what have you. Yep.
Same thing with the goal. I know I was out sick for a while, so I don't know if when I was out sick, if the goals were agreed upon. But I think it's very important that everybody is present, when the goals are set and when the indicators that we're going to use, that we're going to focus on are established. I think it's important for everyone to be able to participate and, So I don't know, Mr. Stevenson, whenever that happens, even if I'm in Panama, may I please get an email so that I can come back and be able to participate in that?
Usually, the superintendent sets his goals, and he presents them to us.
Okay.
And we have a chance, we discuss the goals, and we all get a copy of the superintendent's goals. And that when he presents them, we also have that, at that time, we could ask him to make changes on his goals or add to, from the school committee, goals that we would like to see the superintendent try.
Sure.
So, but we haven't met in recent years to sit down as a committee
Right.
to develop any goals. But the superintendent also will develop his own goals that he presents to us, and which we have copies of which then I use when I do it to go back and look at what the superintendent proposed and then where the school system went, and judge him on that.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, I know you were saying that we can decide as a committee to all place the same weight on the standards. So if we wanted to not have 25% weight across the board.
Yep.
But then we also have to agree on which indicators that we're all judging on.
Yes.
And within those standards.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes. So I would never go so far as to recommend against something that is a provision which is allowed you as a committee in your evaluation. However, I think there's probably a reason why we haven't seen any committees do the weighting. And I don't think it necessarily is all just fear of math. I think it's that notion of we want to make sure we're keeping focus on the 4 standards is probably part of that. Yep.
Thank you.
So just as a reminder, these are the goals on which you've been evaluated, right, that you will be evaluating. These are the goals that you had for this year. I just cut the part that was actually the goal. So you've got the scaffolding of lesson plans in terms of middle school math. And you had, again, a whole list of benchmarks and sort of how this was going to sort of play out over the course of the year. Your district improvement goal is the one about the multi-year strategic plan. Wouldn't surprise me at all if you see that one again, right? It usually takes a little bit longer than this, depending on how far you got. And then the professional practice goal was the new superintendent induction program. So that's the one that you'll see being essentially completed this year, and then you'll be seeing some sort of a new professional practice goal for next year, okay? And again, in every case, you had, as part of the goals that were presented to you at the beginning of the year, because I saw it too, the whole list of, and here's how we're going to get there, and here's what you're going to see over the course of the year, okay? And I'd recommend when you do the evaluation, going back to those, not only in terms of being able to evaluate the goal, but also in terms of probably being able to evaluate a bunch of the indicators as well, because they do actually go together, okay? But for example, for the student goal, if you had this, clearly there are portions under instructional leadership that have to do with things like development of lessons that are appropriate for the students that are in front of you, making sure that things are that appropriately meet the needs of all students. There's a bunch of indicators that would very easily align with that student goal, okay? Same thing with district improvement, same thing with professional practice. So to consider for next year. Now, the goals are the ones that are developed locally, that you adopt as a committee, that are the ones that specifically apply to your superintendent. The standards apply to every superintendent in Massachusetts. Okay, so every superintendent in Massachusetts is evaluated annually or every other year if they're a long-serving superintendent on instructional leadership, on operations and maintenance, on family and community engagement, and on professional culture. And each of those 4 standards has a list of indicators underneath it, okay? And those indicators each have descriptors. Now, I don't want to dwell on that one too much because I think it's more helpful to see the next page, which shows how it works, okay? So, for example, standard 1 is instructional leadership, okay? One of the indicators under instructional leadership is curriculum. So this potentially could even be, depending on how you're taking the middle school math one, this could have been one of them. And then what you have is these descriptions of what does it look like to be, right? What does it look like to be proficient in curriculum as a superintendent under standard 1, okay? What does it look like to be exemplary? What does it look like to be needs improvement? What does it look like to be, and by the way, note for a new superintendent, we don't use unsatisfactory, we use developing. So keep that in mind. But this exists then for each of the indicators under each of those 4 standards. Okay, so the rubric has all of these descriptors. And the nice thing about rubrics is essentially you go through and read each of them and figure out which one sounds like what you've actually got in your hands. Okay, that's what this is for. So then when you're doing the evaluation, and also then as you're moving forward and constructing new ones, you do have the goals in the 3 areas, okay, which we just showed it on the screen. You do have all 4 standards, ratings in each of them. And then what you are required to do is then create a summative rating based on how the 3 goals, what the ratings were on the 3 goals, and what the ratings were on the 4 standards, okay? Now, just as a reminder, moving forward, you don't have to use all the indicators. You should this year because you didn't agree that you were only going to use specific ones, okay? We don't get to make this up now, so we have to do what we set out to do. Moving forward, as we said, you can weigh these standards differently. Sometimes we get asked about when the evaluation has to happen, and the answer is annually. The state doesn't have an opinion as to when you do it. That's up to you. There are, of course, committees that have it tied to things like contract renewals, pay raises, all kinds of things. That's obviously up to you. And then the process for completing the evaluation is also up to you. So who is it that creates your composite evaluation here? Is it something where do all of the evaluations go to you as vice chair, Mr. Stevens? And then you create the composite?
Yes.
Yes.
I was going to say, superintendent is nodding. I'm sorry, and I might be talking too quickly too. So the thing to remember, and this is sometimes one of our trick questions when we do training with new school committee members, right? How many evaluators does the superintendent have? And the answer is 1. Okay, the committee as a whole, the committee as a body, right? So same thing applies here. You each individually fill out an evaluation form. Okay? You each individually score on 4 standards, 3 goals. You each individually come up with your own composite. And then you send that form to Mr. Stevens. It's Mr. Stevens' job then to create a composite of all of those evaluations, okay, that gives the voice of the committee, not of individuals, but of the committee, in terms of where the school committee believes the superintendent is, okay? That then comes back to you. That composite comes back to you as a committee. It is a public document. It is discussed at a school committee meeting, and it is voted by a school committee. And note, by the way, that the committee can amend the document too, just like any other action you take at a committee meeting, okay? So how does that composite get created? One document in which everyone can hear their voice. Now, this doesn't mean and so-and-so said, and so-and-so said, and so-and-so said, okay? We're not trying to fracture things. We're actually trying to create one voice. That doesn't mean you're all going to agree, okay? Does mean that there often is going to potentially be some disagreement, a minority voice that gets to be acknowledged, okay? That's fine. That's how it should work. And then the thing that we emphasize in terms of then how the composite rating works is this one's not actually a math problem. Okay? You don't get to add them all up and divide by the number of people. And frankly, you can't really anyway because you've got 4 on one side and 3 on the other, and the math gets awkward. Okay? What I always recommend is, and you'll see as we go through this, comments are actually part of the process, right? You have sections where you can say, On standard 4, here's some things that I would say. On this goal, here's some things that I would say. I always really encourage the person who's creating the composite to pay a lot of attention to the comments and think a lot about when you get to the end, what is it that the comments are directing that grade to be, okay? And also, what is the overall sort of sense of the committee in terms of where the superintendent is, all right? Now, something that I think also matters a lot, because we live in the kind of, I think, society we do in terms of which everybody needs to get an A, right? We all feel like we're striving for that. It's really important to realize that the word exemplary really means what it says, okay? Under the state standards, exemplary means you could be an example for anyone in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This isn't just you did a really great job and we think you're swell. This is we would actually like send you out to show other people how this is done, okay? It's probably going to be kind of rare. And I say this everywhere. This isn't like a comment here.
Kind of what?
Rare.
Kind of rare. Okay? Proficient is a high standard. That means you are doing it and doing it well. You're doing it to the standard that is required, okay? Exemplary is, gosh, please go tell other people how to do this because you're doing it so well, other people need to learn from you. Those are two very different things, okay? So just keep that in mind because I know that some of us all sort of, particularly if we're like, yay, superintendent, feel like we're doing a great job. Avoid grade inflation, okay? The exemplary is really there to say, this is beyond the high standard that's simply set. We think this is something that you could sort of show off about.
And you are right about that. Sorry for interrupting you, but in Massachusetts, there's a school district that the chair of the school committee had the tendency of saying to the superintendent, "You're doing a wonderful job," but yet still, the students' performance were, not improving. It was just declining, and, they were in probation all over the place. So I'm just saying sometimes, there's the tendency of using that word exemplary. You know what I'm saying? And, so.
Well, and I mean, we certainly can say that someone's doing a wonderful job, but that might actually be proficient. A wonderful job might be proficient rather than exemplary. So the only other things that I would offer are this. We do have sections on our website that have to do with superintendent evaluation, both like where do you actually find the rubric, it's boring things like that, but also other things of that nature. And then the other thing I would note is that the department itself has not only sort of how do you do this in a less sort of snazzy way than our presentations, but also has the rubrics. And also, when we went through, and I say we here because MASC did this with MASS and with DESE. When we went through a revision of the evaluation system, which is part of what brought us, by the way, to the you don't have to use all the indicators, they put together a 5-part video series that's about sort of every piece of this. So if you want to see some other districts where they're sort of where they've really kind of thought about this and thought about how do you do this, how do you do this part of it, there are some resources on the department's website on that.
Okay.
And that, Mr. Vice Chair, is all that I have for you. I'm happy to take any further questions you have.
And I'm happy to send those along to the link to those 5 videos
Great.
that you're referring to.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, Tracy, I think each one of us does our own evaluation.
Yes.
And I tally them. And I put down all the positive and not so positive comments. So the superintendent gets whatever any one of us writes down goes into that final evaluation. So all comments are made.
So something I might encourage you to do instead, so something actually this raises a point that's actually important. Your individual evaluations are public documents. So they don't go along with the agenda, okay, but they are public documents, and it is a best practice for those to just be shared with the superintendent automatically anyway, although I would say do it after you share the composite. I think what might be good for the composite, rather than take all of the comments, since in light of that, so right, so if the superintendent gets all of the individual ones, he can like look at all the individual ones. What might be good is instead is to sort of draw from each of them. And rather than maybe quote them, and I know this is more work, sort of think about redrafting them to capture the general sense of what did people say about instructional leadership, or what did people say about the first goal in general as a committee. But as you said, capturing both the ones that are sort of praise and the ones that are talking about things that need to be improved over the course of it. But see if you can come up with a composite voice of the committee rather than have sort of because I mean, then everybody goes, oh, well, I think that was so-and-so, right? Like, isn't that the first thing you do? Don't set it up to be like a sort of a matching game. Don't give in to the bad impulses of every human being. But see if instead you can sort of say, here's what the Fitchburg School Committee thinks.
Yeah, there are times, we'll say there are 3 comments that the superintendent needs improvement in this area.
Yep.
I just list it once.
Sure. But you also might think about, is there a way, like in any of them, is there a way of capturing maybe more general sentiments rather than quoting?
Yeah. Any suggestions?
And I know, Madam Mayor, if you have any questions, it's unlike anything that anything else you probably have to do. It's one of those where you get sort of like parachuted into this other universe. So.
This is very nice. The last one that it wasn't like this. This is very, so the Department of Education has done some improvement.
That's the rubric that's been the rubric since Act relative to the achievement gap. So I think 2011.
2011?
Yeah.
Oh, I've never seen this one before.
You may not have seen it, but we don't make any guesses as to why that was. But that has been, yep.
But this is good. This
Yes.
is more professional.
And I leave it to the cleverness that you have on staff in terms of how it is that you get it. You probably will get it as an electronic document. The one thing I would say is that however you do that, make sure that it's not like a shared Google Doc, because that does sort of tend people to start just marking it themselves, and don't do that. That's not right. Make sure you're downloading something individually if you're doing it electronically. Other things?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, we have your phone number too.
I was going to say, yes, thank you. You have anticipated my next question, my next comment, Lindsay, which doesn't surprise me at all. If, as you as individuals are filling this out and you find yourself flummoxed, right, or stuck, or need assistance, or if, as you're doing the composite, same thing, although I know you would call me anyway, but please remember that is why we are here, okay? There's one of those sort of shifts. We'll be stopping having budget calls, and we'll start having superintendent evaluation calls sort of any day now. It is not like unusual or outrageous. And the other thing that I always say to school committees that I think is an important thing too, if you sort of find yourself thinking it's nice, it's as a rubric, but it's a little overwhelming. Everybody else who does this is a professional who does this as part of their job. It's only school committees in Massachusetts that are conducting educator evaluation as their sort of, volunteer or part-time thing on top of whatever else that you do, okay? So if you were a principal, you'd be doing this all the time. If you're the superintendent, you're doing it as part of your regular job. You all get it sort of once a year, and it can seem like a lot. So give yourselves a lot of credit because that's, you're doing something that otherwise only the professionals are doing.
Nice as we listen to this. Tracy has been a school committee member, so she's
Well, former at this point, but yes.
former, but has been a school committee member, and so she knows right where we're sitting. She's been there. So.
Yes. Great.
I appreciate
Well, that's it then, Mr. Chair,
very much.
Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Tracy.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay, you don't all have to say it.